program of the Napa
County Historical Society.
We have the privilege and pleasure of
sharing your memories of the past with the rest of us. That past lives on.
Hi, my name is Danielle Barreca with the Napa County Historical Society Board of Directors. Thank you for tuning in today. It is because of the support of members like you that we are able to still provide content during this challenging time. Please consider renewing your membership or gifting a membership to a friend or family member. Thank you, and we hope you tune in again.
Hi, my name is Tom Spalding, and I'm president of the Napa County Historical Society, as well as your tour guide today. Now, before I start the tour, I want to tell you a little bit about the idea behind this tour, which I'm calling Mansions for the Dead. Now, Mansions for the Dead refers to the Victorian ideal of cemeteries being parks for the living and mansions for the dead, as our old executive director Nancy Levenberg always used to point out on cemetery tours. Now, my main interest in local history has been architecture and architects. And for many years I've been researching the fine old houses and historic commercial buildings in the central downtown Napa area. And I also like to take walks at Tulocay Cemetery. And on those walks I often recognize names of people I've just been researching. And that's kind of fun. But I also see many names that I don't recognize. And one time, as I was looking at this grand stone mausoleum, beautiful piece of architecture, and thinking, why don't I recognize this name? Because if that family had the means and the desire to build such a monument to impress people, for just to keep their remains in after they died, certainly they wanted to have, and could afford to have, a fine house while they were alive. So I decided at that time to make a record of all the mausoleums at Tulocay Cemetery, research the histories of the inhabitants, and see if I could track down something about where they lived and find images and descriptions of their houses. So that's the idea behind this tour. There are 24 mausoleums in all, not counting the big one that houses many families, but there are 24 individual family mausoleums at Tulocay Cemetery. 2 of those are really new, built in the 21st century, and we won't be visiting them. But we will be visiting all 22 of the historic family mausoleums here at Tulocay Cemetery, and I'll tell you a little bit about the history of the families that are interred in them, and when I have succeeded, I will share with you also images and descriptions of the houses in which they used to live. Many of these family names will be instantly recognizable to anyone with a basic knowledge of Napa history, because they've been major players in business and politics for years, but there are some that have only tangential relationships. Maybe even kind of a surprise that they have such a grand monument here, because they only had fleeting connections with the Napa Valley. And probably wouldn't be featured on any other tour. So that's enough of an introduction. Let's get started. Ah! We're here at the Coombs family mausoleum, built by Nathan Coombs, although he himself is buried in the crypt next to it, but he had the mausoleum built for his family. Nathan Coombs was, of course, the founder of the city of Napa, and he was quite a wealthy man at the time of his death, but he had not always been so. He was born in Massachusetts, but in 1838 his parents decided to move the family to the Iowa Territory. Just before they set out, Nathan's oldest brother died. On the journey, one of his sisters died. They arrived in Iowa and began farming in a year of drought, and 2 more of his siblings and his father died in the ensuing famine. 3 years later, at the age of only 16, Nathan left his family and joined an emigrant train to Oregon. The next year he joined another train leaving Oregon and heading down to Sacramento, where he found employment on William Gordon's ranch in today's Yolo County. Nathan married Gordon's daughter, Isabella, and the couple moved to the Napa Valley in 1845. In May of 1846, the United States declared war against Mexico, and in June the Bear Flag Revolt occurred in Sonoma. While technically still a part of Mexico, the Napa Valley, which was part of Sonoma District at the time, was under U.S. military occupation. During this period of occupation, Coombs acquired property cheaply. He bought a 260-acre tract of land from Salvador Vallejo, which would become his ranch. And Nicholas Aguirre granted Coombs and his friend John Grigsby a 16-acre piece of land on the west bank of the Napa River between Napa Creek and today's Division Street in return for constructing a Yankee-style roof for his adobe house. Coombs quickly bought out Grigsby's share, had the land surveyed and mapped, and started selling lots in his newly created Napa City. Just over a year later, he bought an additional 64 acres from Aguirre adjoining the original property. Now, I say he bought it cheaply during this period because both Salvador Vallejo and Nicholas Aguirre were Mexican natives in a land under U.S. military occupation. And it was uncertain what would happen to their property that had been granted by Mexican governors should the area become part of the United States, as it did on February 2nd, 1848. It was in their best interest to get anything of value they could for any land that they weren't using intensively at the time. Between his ranch operation and sales of town lots, Nathan Coombs did very well for himself. He imported pedigreed racehorses from Kentucky, became a breeder, and issued betting challenges to other racehorse owners in the state. He served 2 terms in the California Assembly, and he built himself a fine house on his ranch northwest of town, around the area of today's West Pueblo Avenue. Unfortunately, I have not been able to locate any photographs or drawings of the house, only this one brief description in a newspaper in 1876, which said, Honorable Nathan Coombs has been repairing and rebuilding his dwelling house, which is now 3 stories high with a mansard roof, and looms up from the road like the baronial mansion of an English lord. Welcome to the Jesse Grigsby Mausoleum. Margaret and Jesse Grigsby of Missouri arrived in the Napa Valley in September of 1850, joining Jesse's brother, Captain John Grigsby, who had been a member of the Bear Flag Revolt and was a friend of Nathan Coombs. Margaret and Jesse farmed in various spots in the county, including Berryessa Valley. He served 2 one-year terms as county supervisor from 1854 to 1856. He retired to the city of Napa with his house at the end of Coombs Street near Napa Creek. But apparently he was a bit restless in retirement, so in 1888 he started building houses to rent on his property. And he even put in a short street to the west of Coombs Street called Grigsby Court. A newspaper at the time reported, Mr. Grigsby is in his 70th year, but has the building and improvement fever, and intends that his lots in the part of town where he resides shall be covered with good substantial houses. Grigsby Court is still there, although it is a rather obscure corner of downtown Napa. My research indicates that Grigsby's house was on the southwest corner of Coombs Street and Grigsby Court, and old maps indicate the house was still there in 1924, but gone by 1949. The lot today is occupied by the Napa Valley Center for Spiritual Living. I have found no images of the house Margaret and Jesse Grigsby lived in, but several of the houses they built on Grigsby Court and which their children lived in are still there. Stop number 4 is the Smith-Brown Mausoleum. Chloe and Smith Brown were native New Englanders. They set out from Amherst, Massachusetts to Southern California in 1852 with their children and Smith's uncle, Daniel Wheelock. Chloe was pregnant at the time of their journey, and she gave birth to their youngest child in Utah that September. Arriving in Southern California, they soon made their way north. In the Napa Valley, Smith worked as a rancher, operated a hotel, invested in the Napa Valley Railroad Company, and served as its president, became a banker, and was elected as a Napa County supervisor. The Browns would come to own 3 large properties, all of which they lived on at various times. A ranch east of town, another ranch south of town, and a winery north of town. That winery was called Escol Winery, and is still in operation today as Trefethen Family Vineyards. They were living there when they celebrated their 50th anniversary by having a chartered train bring guests from San Francisco, stopping in Napa to pick up even more guests, and then delivering them directly to the winery grounds. They were still living there when they hired Napa's most important architect, Luther Turton, to design a house for them on their property south of town along Soskell Avenue, where Napa Valley College, Kennedy Park, and the golf course are now situated. This house was called Delta Lodge, and I found many mentions of this house in Napa and San Francisco newspapers, but as yet I haven't found any images of it, nor have I been able to determine what has become of it. Moyes Mausoleum is our next stop, and in terms of grand houses and Napa history, the name Moyes is quite prominent. As you drive along Jefferson Street between First and Clay, you pass right in between two of the family's houses, both of which are on the National Register of Historic Places. On the west side stands the house of Julia and Joseph Moyes, constructed for the family in 1892 and is by Napa's most important architect, Luther Turton. It is commonly known as the York House now, after a family that occupied it later on. Joseph Moyes was born in Portland, Maine, into a well-to-do family. The 1860 census shows that his father was city treasurer, his oldest brother was a merchant, and another brother was a law student. By 1870, he had arrived in Napa, and although he was listed in the 1870 census as a farmer, he soon was working in the James H. Goodman and Company Bank, and had worked his way up to the vice president at the time of his death. In fact, one of his children was named James Goodman Moyes, and he received $5,000 from James Goodman when James Goodman passed away. He married San Francisco native Julia Mudgett in Napa in 1876. Across Jefferson Street from Julia and Joseph's house lies the house of their son, Frank G. Moyes, and his wife, Juana, which currently houses the offices of the Wine Spectator. Frank Moyes operated the Moyes Lumber Company, which his parents had purchased from H.H. Knapp when he was only 21 years old. In 1903, work was begun on his house across the street from his parents, and it was completed the next year. Although it has mistakenly been attributed to both of Napa's most important architects, Luther Turton and William H. Corlett, it was in fact designed by Dr. Franklin Oliver of Oakland. Now you might think Dr. Oliver was a doctor and not an architect, but in fact doctor was his first name and not his profession. Professionally, he went by the name D.F. Oliver, presumably to avoid confusion. Ah! We have our second Brown mausoleum on the tour, this one for Martha Brown. The woman who had this mausoleum built was born Martha Toll in Massachusetts in 1850. She married German immigrant Conrad Brown and was living with him in Sacramento in the 1870s when their daughter Eva and son Willie were born. The 1880 census shows them in Virginia City, Nevada. She bought property in Napa in 1884 and had the mausoleum built the following year. I'm guessing that her husband Conrad and her son Willie died before she moved to Napa, as their names are listed inside the mausoleum, but Tulocay Cemetery does not have records of their burials. I have not been able to find a mention of their deaths in the Napa newspapers. When the mausoleum was constructed, the Napa Register wrote that it was on the point in the northwest corner of the grounds overlooking Napa City and the entire lower portion of the valley. We are tempted to call this particular locality Inspiration Point. For certain it is that there is no other place in Tulocay or near at hand where such a beautiful, entrancing view of hill and vale can be obtained. We do not wonder that the owners of the lots in the vicinity wish, when their work is done, their life journey finished, to be here laid away. Now Martha only lived a short time in Napa, in a house just east of Wilson Street on the south side of what is now 3rd Street, which was then called Pendergast. Today there's a 1980s apartment building on the lot, which is squeezed in between two historic houses. In 1887, she remarried and moved away, first to Seattle and then to San Francisco. She had one child with her second husband, Marguerite, whose remains are in this mausoleum. According to Tulocay Cemetery records, Martha is also entombed here, but I don't see her name engraved inside. Now, what most people find interesting about this mausoleum is something completely different. It's this bullet hole right here, if you can See that? This bullet hole comes from a wild police chase involving stolen vehicles through Napa and eventually down to Vallejo, in which Sheriff Jack Clausen opened fire with a machine gun in Tulocay Cemetery on the suspect John W. Ross on October 17, 1948. Ross successfully eluded Napa authorities, but later was found in Los Angeles, and there he died in a shootout with police. Ah! We have the Reynolds Mausoleum. Joseph Reynolds had this mausoleum built in 1880 by the firm of Newman and Wing, who did a lot of the markers out here at Tulocay Cemetery. Joseph, a carpenter by trade, was born in Pennsylvania and moved to Napa with his parents in 1864. At the time the mausoleum was built, that is 1880, Joseph and his wife Julia were living with his recently widowed mother in her house, which originally was the house of riverboat captain Turner G. Baxter, on Seminary Street between Clay and Polk Streets. That would be behind where the empty Safeways building stands today. That house was demolished by 1910. After Joseph's mother Mary died in 1887, he and his wife continued to live in his parents' house until 1901, when they bought a house a block and a half north of the previous house on Seminary at the corner of Polk Street. That house had been built in 1890 by and for Richard W. Benedict, who was a carpenter and contractor by trade. The house is still there. Ah! Here we are at the Cullen Mausoleum. Edward Cullen was born in New York sometime between 1838 and 1840. I haven't yet found out much about his early life, but in 1878 he bought a 280-acre ranch south of Napa, an area that now includes the California 12 and 29 interchange and extended east from there to the Napa River. It was adjacent to the Stanley Ranch, which is probably more familiar to most people. By 1880, he had married Pennsylvania native Carrie Dan. In 1889, they had a two-story house built for themselves in town, on the corner of Pearl and Brown streets, near where Napa Creek passes under Pearl Street. It's a bit hard to picture now because Brown Street no longer goes through to Pearl Street, but we're talking about where the parking lot is on the north side of Coles, where the old bus transfer station is. Even though the Cullens were probably financially secure at this point, they didn't just build themselves a house in town, they built two other two-story houses right next to theirs on the property as rentals. After many years of suffering from a cancerous affliction, Carrie Cullen died in 1896 when their only child, Asil, was 15 years old. His father died less than 7 years later. Asil would find employment as a sheet metal worker at Mare Island and later as a truck driver for a construction crew. But he also inherited the family house and the two rental houses. By 1933, the old family home was gone, and Asil went into business by building Cullen's Gilmore Oil Service Station on the site, constructed entirely of steel and painted in cream and red. I've not found any images of the Cullen family house, but there is a small photo of the service station in a 1933 newspaper. Ah!
Thank you for tuning in today. We hope you enjoyed the programming. Remember, you can social distance while still getting closer to local history.
This story is very much alive.